Welcome to the EcoParent Podcast Network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
When you're 16 and you have a car and you have all your friends on the soccer team, he will eat things that he shouldn't eat. And he can tell me, he's like, well, I can't control my moods. I'm really angry. I'm really upset because it causes that much inflammation. That it's hard. It's a hard thing to teach, but if your child can feel it, if they can notice the difference, then it really makes a huge difference for them as they age.
Hello, families. Welcome back to another episode of the Feeding Families podcast. I have Dr. Piper Gibson with me today. Thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to see you.
I'm really excited to be joining you, Jess. So thank you for having me.
I asked you here. There is so much. I feel like we could talk for hours, and I'm going to try to keep it short and to the point for the busy families that are listening. But there is so much we could talk about. I want to talk about the connection between food and neurological disorders, particularly tics and Tourettes, which is Dr. Gibson's specialty. And I also want to talk about genetics, which is another one of her specialties, eating for your genetics. There's so much talk about genetics and genetic polymorphisms and variants and all of these things. And you're also an expert in that. So I want to talk about those two things in particular. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely. I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah, we're going to dig into some juicy stuff. So Dr. Piper Gibson is a doctor of advanced holistic nutrition, a traditional naturopathic doctor, and a board-certified doctor of natural medicine. She found Regenerating Health and created the Foundations to Flourish program, which teaches parents how to restore their child's health in the face of confusing and worrying diagnoses, things like ADHD, tics, Tourette's, anxiety, sensory processing disorder, autism, and those sorts of things. And she's also, like I say, an expert in nutrigenomics and is the corporate educator at GX Sciences. Gosh, you have dug so deep into food, into nutrients, and how they affect your kids. So why don't we start with, why did you do this? Like, what got you interested in this? What was going on with your boys?
Well, I got into it because I'm a research junkie. 10 years ago, my oldest son was diagnosed with a transient neurological tic. And we tried all the conventional approaches. We went to the pediatrician. We went to the neurologist who said, your son just needs a good spanking.
Wait, what? What?
Yes. The neurologist we went to, I'm not kidding, spent about 5 minutes looking at my son. He goes, there's no reason to run any tests. He just needs a good spanking.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah, I was floored, to say the least. But, we tried 8 different doctors. We tried 10 different prescriptions. We really were doing everything we could to help him with this tic. So he was making vocal tics as well as motor tics. And as parents, we were terrified. We were scared. We had, of course, Dr. Googled everything at that point. And, the conventional approach really tells us just ignore it. They'll grow out of it. But it's really very frustrating for parents. There's not a lot of data. There's not a lot of info. There's not a lot of research. And so we start looking it up ourselves and we become very overwhelmed very quickly. And I, at that point, after trying all these things, just felt like I have to go back to school and really relearn every single thing I think I know about health and wellness in order to help my son. And I will tell you that process has completely changed his life, but changed our lives in the process.
Yeah, I hear this story a lot with the families that I work with and just my colleagues. And so many of us, we're like, what is happening? And so, even a lot of people who don't really intend to do this as a career want to go back and like dig in and study and figure this out. And I think you and I both, as we did this, it's like, wow, this is fascinating stuff that we never learn as parents. There's no handbook saying, hey, mom, dad, here's what your child needs to eat for the next 20 years, and here's why. And then when you dig into it, it's like, wow, food has such an impact on the body that it really is a tool at our disposal to help support our kids.
It really is. And I agree with you. I think 1000%. We are simply uneducated on how to feed our children and what to feed our children.
And I think part of it, like, let me know if you feel the same, but I think part of it is that the research on this has really skyrocketed in even just the last 10, 20 years since you and I have been parents, right? So, back 20 years ago, not that we're that old, but 20 years ago, there was less conversation about this. And I think there's a whole lot more interest and research, and we understand the mechanisms a whole lot differently now, I think.
I do. I think the science is so much different. And I think that our food culture has changed drastically. And I think the nutrients in our soil has changed drastically. And I do see, like, in the last 20 years, a big change. But I think about the way that I ate in high school and, oh.
Yeah. So do you think, I mean, you specialize in helping kids with tics and Tourette's, but any real neurological issue. So, I mean, and you and I, we see this subsection of the population of these kids. So it seems like, oh my gosh, everyone's got these problems. But, to be fair, you and I see the subset of the kids who are struggling. But do you think that this is on the rise? Are there more families struggling with neurodevelopmental issues like tics and Tourette's?
I think, yes, there are more families struggling with tics and Tourette's with neurodevelopmental issues. I do think that there is a much higher incidence of them being diagnosed now. I do think that even still, when you look at information about tics and Tourette's, it's estimated that 1 out of 100, every 162 children will be diagnosed with tics and Tourette's. But they're saying that that's grossly miscalculated in the fact that so many of those go undiagnosed.
And so define it for us before we get into the connection between food and nutrients. So what is tics? What is Tourette's?
So tic disorders are this uncontrollable, repetitive movement. So there's motor tics where people may clap their hands or twitch their neck or frequently blink their eyes. But there's also vocal tics where children will clear their throat or say a word repeatedly. Some of them also experience some OCD kind of tendencies with that say the word repeatedly kind of thing. Tic disorders are usually diagnosed. Right now, they're called provisional. They used to be called transient, but basically they're giving you a year to watch your child. If things improve and it goes away, great. If it doesn't improve, once they've done a combination of motor and vocal tics for over a year, then they will diagnose you with Tourette's. So the issue is that it's done observationally. You go to your pediatrician or your neurologist and they look at you and they watch you and they don't really dig deeper. They just see these outward things and don't look at, like, what's that red light? What's that going on under the hood? What should we really look deeper at?
Yeah, which is the same thing as we'll do with ADHD or a learning disorder or things like that. It's a collection of observed behaviors that fit a diagnostic category. So you get the label, right? Without looking as to, well, why are those things happening? What's causing those things, right? So it sounds very similar.
Yeah, very similar.
So then what traditionally would happen? What kind of medication would be proposed?
So it really kind of depends. There's not really a lot of tic disorder or Tourette specific medications. Most medications that are prescribed for that are what we would call off-label. So they are things that doctors may have used and seen some decrease in tic symptoms. So things like guanfacine, which is a blood pressure medication, frequently used in tic disorders. Then you see children with horrible kind of blood pressure dropping issues. And so when we're looking at that, the conventional approach is ignore it or put a Band-Aid on it and try some medications. So by the time people come to me, they've tried all the medications and they feel like, this isn't working.
I've seen things like Abilify or, sort of medications that are going to work on the neurotransmitters prescribed for that sort of thing.
But you and I both know, and we'll talk about this when we talk about genetics, is that, it may not be that, you don't have enough of that neurotransmitter. It may that be that you have a traffic jam of those neurotransmitters and they're not getting cleared out. So, are those things like Abilify really going to help in that department?
Yeah. So let's dig into that, because I've become fascinated with genetics and nutrigenomics. You really dug into this. How big of an impact did that play on the healing that you did with your kids, just knowing what his genetics were?
It was really huge for him. We had done all this other work. We had changed the diet. We had taken the toxins out of the home. We had done all of the other legwork, but we were still experiencing symptoms, sensory issues, tic issues, mood swings, all sorts of things that we were still experiencing in moderation. And so when we found nutrigenomics, we saw huge changes in him within 30 days once we put him on this individualized genetic approach. And so we were able to look at how well he methylated. So using his B vitamins like folate and B12, did he have neurotransmitter issues? Did he have chronic aggressive inflammation? How well did he detoxify? We were able to look at all of these things that were really impactful for him in regard to his genetics and what he really needed so that he could maintain optimal health.
Yeah, so interesting. So can you, for people who don't know the word nutrigenomics, can you give us a working definition of that?
Simply, it is really looking at the study of nutrition and your genes. So how is food going to impact your genes? How is your environment? So epigenetics, how is your environment going to affect your genes? So how does your outside world impact your genes and the way that they create signals and tell our bodies what to do?
I feel like genetics, they help us get a blueprint to help us understand what the child's tendencies are when they're under stress. Do you think that's fair?
It's fair. I explain it this way. If you drive on a bridge every day back and forth to work, and you know that one, that bridge has a crack in it, and two, it's full of hazards, it's dangerous to drive on, you would do everything you could, working with your city, complaining to your city, fix this bridge, it's not safe to drive on. It's the same way with our genes. We're going to use our genes to figure out what we need to remove, what are those hazards, what needs to go, and what do we need to enforce? How do we reinforce those cracks that we know that you have genetically, you have this predisposition, but what do we need to reinforce that?
And I also want to make the distinction that, sometimes people will go to their doctor and they'll get screening, genetic screening, right? And what we're talking about here is something totally different, right? So can you expand on the differences?
A lot of times, if you go to your doctor, they may be looking at chromosomal issues, like things like Fragile X or Down syndrome. You're looking at the chromosome. We are looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms, which is you have 4 base pairs on your DNA. They pair up. When those pairs get, we'll call it easily enough, mixed up, they don't do what they're supposed to. They are going to tell your genes or your body, your cells, to do different things. It may not work as well. It may not, what's called express. It may not express as well. Think of it like your computer code. If your computer code gets changed, your computer doesn't work as well. Same thing with your genes. If that gene code gets changed, it may not work as well.
So it's it's subtle differences, but man, is it ever impactful, right? It's like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like with something like Tourette's, it's not that there's a chromosomal abnormality that causes an illness. It's not diagnoses that we're looking for in the genes, but what we're looking for is where is there some inefficiencies in the pathways in the body's pillars in terms of how it functions that we can support with food and nutrients that are leading to this kind of behavior.
Absolutely. And that's really the way I see it. And, genomics in general is pretty cutting edge. It's not used widely in every single doctor's office. Not everybody understands it. But those of us that work in that area and utilize it in our practices and teach others how to use it, we really see huge changes in our patients and our clients.
So you mentioned a couple of things like B12 and detoxification for your son. What are some of the other, variations and things that you see genetically that help when you're working with your clients, or even you could talk about your personal experience, help them really tailor their food and their supplement plan to meet the needs of their genetics?
I see a lot of common patterns in one. I would say that, yes, I'm looking at this certain population, but they all have issues with chronic aggressive inflammation. So we're looking at those on and off switches for inflammation. Can you easily turn it on? And then do you have a harder time turning it off? So we know based on that we need to follow a more anti-inflammatory diet. We need to be doing things to reduce inflammation, making sure that they're getting plenty of exercise and sleep. We can see that. The other kind of big thing I see is poor autophagy. So autophagy means self-eating, but it's basically your body's cell recycling system. And when your cells, like a water balloon, are full of a lot of cellular waste, the nutrients you need can't necessarily get in. We can't get a lot of glucose into the cell to make energy, which when you have a neurological issue, your brain is using so much energy. You need to make sure that you're having plenty of glucose in there. And so we may need to use certain nutrients in order to help get that glucose into the cell. So definitely looking more at inflammation, autophagy, and then looking at how well they use things like folate and B12.
And I love it because it's we're talking in this podcast all about feeding families, right? So it's about food, but I want to make the distinction that we've got the feeding part, like you mentioned, an anti-inflammatory diet. So making sure that you're not eating foods that are causing extra inflammation in the brain, especially if you know genetically that you've got a tendency to upregulate inflammation once it's triggered, or a poorer capacity than the average person to turn it off because those genes, like you say, had some variance in them. So that can, I think what I find is that it helps parents get a sense of how much wiggle room they have, right? So, if you have a really good genetically, a really good capacity to like turn it on when it's appropriate, turn it off when it's appropriate, like manage it when it's appropriate, then, you might be okay with a little bit of, sugar, for example, which we know is inflammatory to the system for a short period of time, but you can turn it off. So you might have, a bad day or a bad couple of hours, but you'll come out of it. But if for somebody who has variance in those genes, you're likely to see more severe problems, and you're likely to see them persist for longer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just within the clientele I work with, just my own son, is that we know when he eats things that he shouldn't eat that are kind of out of his anti-inflammatory diet protocol, it takes about 14 days to get him back on track. I mean, which is really a significant amount of time. And so I will tell you that a lot of people that I work with, it is the same thing. If they kind of stray from that, we know that it may take a little longer than the average Joe to get them back on track because they're just very sensitive.
Which is such cool information to know, especially as your kids are growing up, because ultimately they're going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to make decisions about what's worth it and what's not. Like, are you going to go to the birthday party where there's going to be stuff that you're going to have to either say no to, or you're just going to have to suck it up and say, well, okay, I don't want you to be different. And, if you know that it's going to be 14 days, of whatever it's going to be and what's happening. Maybe there's a soccer match, maybe there's an exam, maybe there's, something important within those 14 days. You can start to make really strategic decisions about what you're going to say yes and no to. And you can help your child make strategic decisions once they get older about what's worth it and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of my biggest tips for parents is don't be afraid to go to the birthday party, but take your own food. The parents that are hosting that birthday party will not think you are rude. They will be completely fascinated when you tell them, my child is very sensitive to gluten and dairy. We can't just have a regular pizza. So I'm bringing a pizza. Let them know ahead of time I'm bringing a gluten-free, dairy-free pizza. I made, special cupcakes. They, and they'll say, well, why? And you explain to them, well, this is the deal. He has mood swings. He has this, he has that. They are fascinated and they want to know more when you start to explain why you're feeding your child this certain way. So don't be afraid and don't be embarrassed to stand up and be like, no, this is what my child needs. I'm going to bring them a special diet to the birthday party, to the celebration after the soccer game, whatever it is. I mean, he's 16. I still do it. I still make those special batch of cupcakes because I know in the long run, it really benefits him. And I'm doing what's best for my child. So don't hesitate.
Yeah. And he's 16 now?
He's 16.
And is he kind of get it now?
Oh, he gets it. But, when you're 16 and you have a car and you have all your friends on the soccer team, he will eat things that he shouldn't eat. And we do, I can tell, like within hours, I can go in his room and be like, what did you eat? And he can tell me, he's like, well, I can't control my moods. I'm really angry. I'm really upset because it causes that much inflammation that, we're seeing this huge change in his mood.
I feel like that is the goal right there, right? You can't control everything that your kids eat, especially as they get older, right? And if we can get them to a point where they can start to make educated choices and decisions about what they put into their body, they're going to drop the ball every now and then. It's going to feel worth it to them. It's going to feel more worth it to them to have the pizza or whatever it is with their soccer team than to say no sometimes, right? But if you can get them to that point where they understand their body, I think wow, that's a huge parenting win.
And that's really kind of one of the goals I have with all of the people that I work with is if you can teach your child to listen to their body, then they're going to know when something really throws them off track or messes them up or makes them feel like crazy. It's hard. It's a hard thing to teach, but if your child can feel it, if they can notice the difference, then it really makes a huge difference for them as they age.
Hey parents, this episode of the Feeding Families podcast is brought to you by the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition. Are you looking for practical knowledge and tips on how to start eating and living healthier? Would you like to get a taste of holistic nutrition? Food can make a huge difference to how you feel, but with the overwhelming amount of information out there, it's hard to know where to start. The Healthy Eating and Lifestyle Certificate Workshops hosted by CSNN is a series of fun workshops to get you excited about healthy eating and lifestyle changes for you and your family. No prior knowledge of holistic nutrition is required. Get basic foundational knowledge about digestion and gut health, healthy fats, essential vitamins and minerals, stocking your whole food pantry, and more. It's available at select CSNN branches. You can learn more at csnn.ca/holistic-family or follow the links in the show notes. Do you feel like knowing their genetics and doing some of the other functional tests that you did, do you think that accelerated your progress with your kids so that you could really identify what's in your toolbox? Like what are the do's and what are the don'ts? What are the things that are going to give us those 14 days of mess?
Yeah, it definitely did. It was very eye-opening to really be able to kind of connect those dots. So we went from being told, just ignore it. There's nothing you can do about it. And things were progressively getting worse to us being able to look at results in functional lab testing, stool testing, hair tissue mineral analysis testing, genetic testing, food sensitivity testing, all of these things that we did, and really be able to look at, well, here's this connection. All of these things really go together when you start to lay it out. And based on that, we were able to really refine, especially diet. Diet is a huge thing for me, but he needed to be gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free, peanut-free. He needed to follow this more anti-inflammatory diet using all of these nutrient dense, fruits and vegetables, getting plenty of protein. So we were able to really refine his diet, but also looking at the other things that he needed. He didn't sleep ever as a baby. There was no sleeping to be had. He would nap for 15 minutes and that was the end of that. And when we looked at genes, we were able to figure out why he really wasn't sleeping well and how to get him to a place where he could sleep 12 hours a day like he does now.
Well, I got to dig into that a little bit because so many parents struggle with sleep. So is there any, what was one little nugget that you learned about what was keeping him awake?
He was very sensitive to glutamates. Glutamates are in our food naturally, amino acid, but you end up with an imbalance of glutamic acid in the brain and GABA, which is this calming neurotransmitter that's going to help us relax, go to sleep. And so when he was eating packaged, processed, garbage food, those glutamates would cause this imbalance in his brain and he wouldn't be able to sleep. And back then, we didn't know any better. We were the drive-through family. We really didn't know any better as far as nutrition. And it took me relearning everything to be like, okay, all makes sense now.
Yeah. And is that because of the polymorphism in the GAD SNP gene? Yeah. So that's one to look for. And even inflammation too, right? You can't sleep very well when you are fully inflamed.
That's absolutely part of it.
If he's eating the glutamate and then he's upregulating that inflammation and then he can't turn it off, it's I feel like it gives parents a little sense of okay, I get it. It's not my fault.
It does. And it makes so much sense when people start to look at it and I start to explain, there's this aha moment and everybody's like, oh, that makes so much sense. I didn't know that. How come nobody tells me that? How come nobody told me this before?
So the other part of nutrigenomics was the supplement situation. Feeding families is, it's partly food, but it's also the strategic use of supplements to fill nutritional gaps. So was that a big piece for you?
It was, because especially as a parent who had a child with a tic disorder, is when you Dr. Google tic disorders and Tourette's, The typical recommendations are use magnesium, use B6. And for most families, they're really frustrated because they feel like, well, that didn't do anything. That didn't work. And when we did the nutrigenomics, it helps you to figure out the right dose and the right amount for the right person at the right time. So we were really able to refine like what he actually needed and how much of it he needed. And, it was really very eye-opening and a huge part of that change. So I've had a lot of parents send me like pictures of their bottles of fruits and veggies. And they're like, what do you think of this? And I'm like, well, that's great. But if you're going to take a capsule anyway, like let's really consider based on your genes, what nutrients we can take as a capsule form instead of our body going through the process of digesting these fruit and veggie tablets. Your child may need more of a certain nutrient that they're not going to get just from a fruit and veggie tablet.
So you can really get strategic and targeted. And, our kids all need the fruits and veggies, and there's lots of great antioxidants in there. And that's also going to help bring the inflammation down and all of that good stuff. There's just no one thing. It's not going to be magnesium. It's not going to be B6. Sometimes these things I find they move the needle more, but it's usually a combination of things.
It really is. And I really stress that to parents is that there's no magic bullet. And a lot of parents are in these support groups where they give like one and done suggestions, take magnesium, use this supplement called Tic Tamer. And then they all feel like, well, I've tried everything and nothing works because there's no layout. There's no step-by-step plan for them to say, this is the approach you should be taking and not just throwing some magnesium at it.
Mm-hmm. I hear a lot of parents say things, once they're deep into it, like, 10 years later, once they have their customized toolbox and they know how to manage symptoms and they know why everything is happening, they can start to feel like this was a gift.
And that's really where it was for us is that, there was a point in time where I felt like we were in a really dark place. We were scared, frustrated, overwhelmed. I felt like, is this his lot in life? How is he going to deal with this for the rest of his life? And it was very scary to me. And I would scream into my pillow and I would cry in front of my mom's groups because it was like, what do I do? I felt so lost. But once we've gone through this process, I went back to school. I did all these things. I feel like I've seen the light at the end of the tunnel and it is glorious. And we can use that. Yes, we went through hell, but we can use that process to say, look, I've got this step-by-step plan. This is really how we should look at it.
Which is why you do what you do.
That is why I do what I do.
I see this too. Every parent goes through that process of like the overwhelm, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness and the confusion. And then eventually, like when you start looking for answers, I think you have to ask the right questions to get the right answers, right? And I think the question that you asked and that I hope a lot of parents ask is, what's going on in there?
It was. There's a study that shows that 50% of parents experience grief and anger and depression when their child is diagnosed with a neurological issue. I think part of it is that I'm part of this small percentage of people who still asks why. You think about your toddler, ask why all the time. Well, I still do that. Well, why? Can someone please explain why? And I think that's really what kind of set me off is I felt like he didn't just happen one day to have this symptom, like didn't just pop up. There is something like a switch got turned on. Why did that switch get turned on? What is really going on deeper?
That's so great. And even when we dig into working with people, it's like, well, why does melatonin help so much? Why does B6 help to the extent that it does? How come it's not being absorbed very well? Why is that food setting you off so much? Food is supposed to be nourishing to the body. Why are apples causing you to spiral into madness?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a big puzzle piece. And I think it takes somebody like you and I to really put that together for people, because otherwise you're like, as a parent, your brain is just going to explode.
You might, one quick thing that you mentioned was detoxification. And it might sound like a bit of a stretch when we're talking about food to be talking about detoxification, but it's very, very much connected. And I wonder if you could just speak for a couple of moments about what you see in terms of neurological stuff, tics, Tourettes, the inflammation that's going on in the brain with this, and toxins found in our food supply.
So let's just take Glyphosate, for example, everybody knows about it. It's the active ingredient in Roundup. It's sprayed on our food heavily, pretty toxic. And so, makers of glyphosate will tell you that it has no harm to humans. Well, it does, because it's designed to harm the bacteria, the bugs, the things that are in the soil. So when you are eating it on your food and you're digesting it, it kills that good bacteria in your gut. You have to have this good bacteria. So you end up with an inflamed gut, which connected to the brain. You end up with an inflamed brain, and you end up with toxins. So toxins are really found in fat. They love fat. And so you have 3 phases of liver detoxification, phase 1, 2, and 3. And we have to have certain nutrients from our food, like magnesium and folate and B12, to perform these phases of detoxification within the liver. And so glutathione is your body's number 1 antioxidant. You make it in your body. But some people have genetic variants where they don't make enough of it. They don't make the right kind of it. And glutathione's action is to bind to those fat toxins within your fat and make them water soluble so that you excrete them in your bile, your urine, your stool. And so when we end up with, hey, we're constantly eating food covered in glyphosate, we end up with a toxic overload, causing inflammation, killing our gut bacteria. When we're inflamed, again, our water balloon, our nutrients aren't getting in. They're not doing what they need to do. So you end up with nutrient deficiencies. You have to have enough of these nutrients to be able to make the glutathione. So it's really this vicious cycle of not enough nutrition, not being able to detoxify, continuing to eat glyphosate-laden food. It's all part of the mix. So when we say there's not one thing that's going to fix it, most parents probably never considered that and thought about it. I know I didn't until I really dug into the science.
Yeah, and it's compounded by the problem of our soils being depleted of nutrients, and our farming practices, and our storage, and our long transit times from picking to eating and things like that. So we've got fewer nutrients in the food, less capacity to use those nutrients, more need for those nutrients, and then we've got some kids that have genetically need even more.
And when you talk about most kids that you and I are seeing, so, especially me with the tics and Tourette's, is that these kids are in this constant state of fight or flight. And when we are in this constant state of fight or flight, our body uses up nutrients at a much faster rate. And so if we're not getting the nutrients we need and our body's constantly churning to use all of these nutrients at a faster rate because we're under stress, then it really kind of puts us into this vortex where we fall deeper and deeper into this hole, and our health gets worse and worse because we're burning faster and we're not getting what we need.
Oh gosh. Okay. We got to lift it up here a bit. We
You're
need
right.
something inspiring. We need some inspiration here. So to get ourselves out of the, I think there's some people listening who are like, oh my gosh, that's my kid. My kid is having neurological issues or tics or Tourette's or whatever. And then there's other parents who are listening who are like, well, we don't have that problem now, but oh my gosh, maybe it'll develop, or, maybe we risk going down into that vortex. Well, I mean, we just finished talking about how there's no one thing, but if we could talk about a couple of things that are really doable that you would recommend people focus on, if they really can only focus on 1 or 2 things at a time, where should they start, do you think?
I would say an organic, gluten-free, dairy-free diet. Because when you get rid of gluten and dairy, you're getting rid of 2 really inflammatory foods. And when we go organic, we are really starting to eliminate a lot of the toxins that are in our food. So I think focusing on a nutrient-rich organic diet, and that includes, I'm talking about fresh, whole foods. I am not talking about anything that comes in a box, a bottle, or with a barcode on it, or a bag. I'm really talking about those things that you're going to get at the grocery store from your local farm that are those whole foods. So diet for me as a doctor of holistic nutrition is really, really huge. And I think that if you can do just a couple of things, it's really focusing on the diet.
I can even sense some overwhelm from people listening of saying, okay, so that means cooking everything from scratch. That means eating at home all the time and all of these things. And I think, tell me if you think this jives with what you have seen. You'll hear a lot of nutritionists say gluten-free, dairy-free, organic. And now I think, you guys can go back into, somewhere around minute 15 or 20 where Dr. Gibson explained why we need those extra nutrients and we got to get the chemicals out. And so I find that if it feels like a stretch, it feels overwhelming, the first thing that needs to happen is you need to just say, okay, I'm going to take Dr. Piper Gibson's word for it because she sees this over and over and over. She says this is going to help. So let's try it. And then I find it helps sometimes to put a time frame around it.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to do everything at once. I mean, I've got parents that are like, they go home and they throw everything in their pantry away. But think about, okay, here's the first thing we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is start eating organic. And that can make a huge difference for a lot of people. Just start eating organic. Once you've done that for a few months and you feel comfortable with that, it's not a matter of throwing everything in your pantry away or, throwing everything in your spice cabinet away. If you run out of garlic powder, next time go buy organic garlic powder. You don't have to go buy brand new everything, but get to where you're comfortable eating organic for a couple of months. And you don't have to overthink like cooking at home. Like keep it really simple. Meat and vegetables. It doesn't have to be a 5-course meal. Then once you're comfortable with that, then you can say, okay, the next thing we're going to do is gluten-free because there's a whole ton of really good gluten-free substitutes. Then you can make that transition, 60 days. And then you can add in the next transition. So if you feel like doing all of those things at once is going to be overwhelming, break it down into bite-sized steps. My husband always says, how do you eat an elephant? And my kids say, one bite at a time. You've got to take those small steps if that is really appealing for your personality.
And what if you can only do it part of the time? Do you think it's still worth it? Let's say there's like a split family, mom's on board, dad's not, or, the kid's older and they're like your son is, going to pizza parties on their own and what have you. Is it still helpful, do you think, to do what you can?
Yeah, I do think it's helpful to do what you can. And I will have some parents tell me that, they'll work really hard for 2 weeks at home with mom and then they'll go to dad and dad will give them McDonald's and everything will change and things will fall off the rail. And sometimes it takes that for the other parent involved or grandma and grandpa. I see a lot of grandma and grandpa do the same thing to help them to really realize, okay, this isn't the best choice for this child. And, I really talk to parents about, one, we record all our sessions. So, hey, show them that, this video. But two, really turning it around and asking them, grandma and grandpa, do you want to see, Joe get better and have better moods and be able to focus in school? Or do you want to keep offering him treats that really impact his mind, body, spirit? And I think you need to make an appointment. You need to sit down, you need to plan it and have these honest conversations with those family members who may be hesitant.
Everyone wants the best for kids, right? It's like, you just have to sort of point out that this is a tool that you're trying. And I would also emphasize that you don't need to have 3 doctorate degrees in order to try something.
Agreed. I didn't have 3 doctorate degrees before I tried anything. I did do a lot of experimenting, but I think that's why parents come to me now is because they feel frustrated experimenting. And, you have a plan. I have a plan. Let's lay it out.
That's so great. Thank you so much for coming. I think if there was sort of one final piece of advice or word of wisdom that you could pass on to families who are really struggling to feed their kids, or just even if they're not struggling, they just want to do the best they can for the kids to keep them healthy and strong, what would it be?
This is a huge one for me is follow your mother's intuition. There's a lot of moms out there who feel like something's not right, something is off, but they're just not listening to that mother's intuition. And I will tell you, out of all the mothers I work with, when something is off, when something isn't right, and you really need to sit down and get real with yourself and listen to that mother's intuition and really look at it as a guide. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit woo-woo, but, I feel like a lot of moms ignore it. They just don't trust that gut instinct. And I think that makes a huge difference. If you feel like, dairy, I really feel like, dairy might be bothering them, but they really love dairy. Don't write that off. Like your gut is telling you something. So listen to your mother's intuition. It is there for a reason.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to follow up with you, where can they find you?
They can find me at www.regenerating.health. And I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Regenerating Health. And then also on Facebook, I have a tic disorders parent support group. So if you are struggling with tics and Tourette's and you're looking for some additional tips, resources, pointers, you can search Tic Disorder Parent Support Group and that should come up for you.
That's fantastic. And we will link to all of those things in the show notes so people can find you. Thank you so much, Dr. Piper Gibson, for coming and sharing your wisdom with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
So, if you listen to podcasts or watch YouTube, you've probably heard it 1,000 times before. The plea to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. Well, here we are again. But seriously, the review is especially important to us, as it has a huge impact on our discoverability amongst the zillions of podcasts all competing for your attention. So please consider leaving a review. And heck, we'd really love to hear your feedback. This pilot episode of the EcoParent Podcast Network was made possible with the generous support of Ontario Creates. Thanks for listening.